So did you find any differences in your work across like different groups of women that had experiences?
Absolutely. I would argue also that it is not simply a women's issue, because I remember talking to a journalist up in San Francisco, and he said, I have 4 daughters, and I'm very concerned that, so people who love women, they are our parents, our husbands, our sons who are men, it is also their issue. So it's not only a women's issue. But I think, as with everything, it is difficult to generalize, and it's incorrect to generalize and say that everything fits all. And certainly, you find different levels of fear among women. First of all, not all women are afraid, and women are not. The other message I want to pass is that women are not born being afraid. Yet every victimization survey finds women, on average, more afraid than men. And so these are the social norms that make women more afraid, oftentimes. But not all women are similarly afraid. Typically, you find older women more afraid than younger women, so age as a role. You find minority women usually more afraid than white women. This has something to do with the neighborhoods they live in that typically are more crime-ridden. Disabled women and men are typically more afraid than able women and men. So you find these nuances for sure. And again, even within these groups, you find variations.
I mean, it's interesting I think that the point about that women are not born fearful, I think is a really important point to put out. And, I think that, in a lot of my work in bicycling, it's like, there's women just want to be more protected or, something like that. It's like, that's not, it's the environments in which we're existing and kind of the activities and what you see, like that's shaping it, that we're not really inherently afraid as a group.
Absolutely. And you brought up biking, and here in the US, a minuscule percentage, as you know better than anyone, of bikers are women. And again, this is something to do with this fear of being exposed in public, and some of that has to do with fear of harassment.
Yeah, so, in this work, not only did you kind of do all these interviews and to figure out, what's the problem and looking at how it affects people's behavior, but also you interviewed the agencies to see, okay, what are they doing? So, what would you find were some of the most common strategies that agencies were doing? And do you feel like these countermeasures and what they're doing is really addressing the needs that you were finding in the other parts of the research?
Yeah. First of all, I found something that was quite pervasive in transit agencies, which I think is a myth. And this is the universality of needs. And so a number of transportation agencies, and some of them, unfortunately, even women leaders, would say, well, people have universal needs, and we really have to serve these universal needs. Well, I'm sorry, but this is not true, I think. Men and women have some specific needs. And this comes from the ways that, so for example, I'll give you some examples. I'm not going to say that men do not take care of kids or parents, but overall, on average, you have many more women being the primary caregivers for their kids and for older parents. You have many more women with strollers, for example, that try to get on the vehicle. That's immediately a need. The fact that women, for one reason or the other, are typically more afraid, that's a specific need. So the attitude, and I surveyed 135 transportation agencies, many of them kind of representation from all over the US. These were large transit operators and medium-sized transit operators, and only 1/3 of the respondents acknowledged that there are specific needs. And what I found quite shocking was that there were only 3 agencies that had put together specific programs for women. Now, 3 out of 135. Now, this was in 2009. I have not really repeated that. I would hope that there may be a few more programs, but I have not seen big differences. I know you have a question about what we can do about it, so I'll stop and wait for that question.
Well, so, I mean, I think specifically in Los Angeles, Metro, our transit operator, was doing an interesting survey of former riders. So people that used to take transit but that weren't doing it anymore. And they found that 30% said they had stopped taking Metro because they felt unsafe. So while they did in this work found the percentage of respondents had experienced some form of, unwanted sexual behavior, and that was on the slight decline, that this kind of issue about harassment, and particularly with the context of transit ridership declines, is really kind of seems to be one of things on a long list of what Metro is trying to reverse. So, if you were, on the Metro board and you saw this, what types of strategies would you recommend specifically to Metro to address this issue?
Well, just one comment that their survey was of choice riders, people who had the option and the ability to stop taking Metro. But I think that at least I was finding a much more pervasive issue when you talk to captive riders, people who have to take Metro. And again, it is not a problem of Metro, it's a problem of a number of transit operators that have. Well, there are a number of things. I think things should start what other countries are doing and what other transit operators are doing. We have some good examples. First of all, there are certain countries in the world, and I include the UK, Australia, Scandinavian countries that have the so-called gender mainstreaming policies, and these really ask public agencies to do gender impact reports. So basically, if you have a new policy, if you have particular settings that you're operating, what is their impact on women and how it affects women? And this is by federal policy, the agencies have to do that in other countries. We have nothing of that sort here in the US. There are a number of things that I think could be very helpful. From, first of all, you find many more women more fearful waiting in the public environment or the bus stop than on the bus. So where you're locating the bus stops, how these may be closer to centers of activity where you have more natural surveillance. How you educate the drivers to really know how to respond. One of the 3 programs that I mentioned, I found in one of the transit operators in the US was a basic training for the drivers. The drivers really encouraging women to sit, and there were seats in the front of the bus closer to the driver. And another program was a program that would allow women to disembark from the bus, even if it was not their bus stop, if it was closer to where they were going, especially in the evening. So these are all good things. In Great Britain, there are spaces in the bus where you can put strollers and you can put big bags, and so you don't have to hassle with them. Again, this may affect men too, but it's usually women that disproportionately carry those. Education messages. New York Metro had once big signs saying that report harassment, it will be persecuted. I mean, these things are certainly important. So there are different, and in some of my writings I'm arguing that this is an issue that you really need to have different prongs in responding, through environmental design, through education, through policing, through making people not being ashamed to report some of these issues. And another example comes from Canada and the so-called safety audits that in the Toronto Transportation Agency would do with women, that they would walk with women around their neighborhood and the bus stops and asking women to really indicate where they're afraid and why and what they want to see. Real-time information about buses. Portland has that. So through an app, you can see, for example, when the next bus is coming to minimize the amount of time that you're waiting at the bus stop, because that's, again, a kind of a stressful time for a lot of women, especially at night. So there is a ton of things that you can do. Some of these are expensive, but some of these are less expensive. But it is a major issue. It does affect about 50% or more of transit riders.
So, I think this point you made about the trying to reduce the embarrassment around reporting. I mean, I think that it's a very kind of underlying issue, and that because if you were in a workplace and you were experiencing sexual harassment, the person, right? Like, you can go to HR and say, Eric Smith, we had this interaction. You kind of name names, right? But in public space, you don't really have that. So in a sense, like, by reporting, you're not actually doing anything for yourself, right? Like, so it has to be this kind of altruistic almost part to say, like, to try to do something better. Yeah. And it's, I think on a personal level, when I've had bad experience like this, I don't really want to rehash it, right? Yeah. Like, that's kind of the other part. So what do you kind of, these ideas about how do we combat embarrassment, but wanting people to report, but not knowing how that kind of mix of things.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. But there could be clear directions to report it to the bus driver, right then and there. You go and you report that this person is harassing me. Women have not been doing this in general. I'm hoping that, again, I said it's a watershed moment, and I'm us to blame. When I was being harassed in the buses in Greece, I never reported anything, and nobody was expected to report anything. The other thing that the women I was interviewing here, a lot of Latina women in particular, had mentioned that they would not report it. They're afraid to report, they're afraid of the authorities, they're afraid of the police. So there is this other level that affects some immigrant women even more so. On some, because we're talking about examples, there has been some grassroots initiatives that have been effective. There are, some of you may know the Hollerback websites. Has anybody heard about those that have popped up for a number of years now in a number of cities, where they're basically asking, now that everybody has smartphones, to take the image of the person that is harassing you and send it to them, and they're putting it on their website, and kind of, it's public embarrassment. And sometimes it did lead to some convictions, a couple of times. So, I think that you're absolutely right. It is, quite often women feel ashamed. That's why I think that if there is some kind of authority on the bus, and in the bus is the bus driver, where someone can report, but also by being complacent, we do not help anybody else, we do not help ourselves.
Yeah, so it's kind of like trying to, make sure that we're all trying to be part of the solution in a way. So, this kind of flood of harassment and abuse scandals over the last months are showing that this isn't really isolated to one particular industry. I mean, I think everything, and we can kind of look to see the vulnerabilities of women or just vulnerable people in a bunch of, different situations. But particularly kind of at the beginning, we talked about how this really restricts women's movement. You talked about this, early 20th century New Yorker piece, but you actually had some other interesting examples about kind of men versus women and kind of historical context and moving about the city. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, if you look into women's movement in this city and you kind of study urban history, you see that women's movement in the US was much more constrained than men's. I mean, women were not supposed in the early 20th century years to enter much of downtown, especially middle class and upper class women. And it was only with the coming of the department store that there was an area that was okay for women to move. And it was only lower income women, especially peddlers, that had more of a freedom, if you like, to be in public spaces. Otherwise, other women were, if alone in public spaces, were perceived as streetwalkers, prostitutes, etc. A lot has changed with the entrance of women in the labor force, and we are absolutely way beyond that point. But again, and as you know, I'm a student of public spaces. I study public spaces, and typically women are much more still underrepresented in public spaces. Take parks, for example. Usually women, if you find women in parks, they're usually with other women or with their kids, or sometimes if they're in parks, they come there to walk their dog or to jog. You find many more men that come to the park on their own, because that's not a taboo. And so even today, even though things have much improved, but there are other parts of the world. I have started looking into other parts of the world, and definitely the global south, and depending on the particular cultures and religions and situations, you also have, in certain places, quite a lot of constrained mobility from the part of women. And I would say that in the global south, for many, many places, it is now still worse than in the global north, because we have seen a lot of women entering the labor forces. We have started seeing transportation planners will tell you that a lot of the travel patterns in the global north are converging. We have now many more women having driver's licenses. The numbers start approaching those of men if they're not yet the same. So you find some convergence in terms of travel patterns, but I would still argue that even in the most developed countries of the global north, women's mobility and representation in public spaces is not yet equal to men's.
So there's probably a lot of different things that could be done about that, societal norms and things like that. But what do you think about the idea of, particularly kind of going back to like a bus stop or a rail platform, about kind of the role of surveillance or cameras, and is that helpful? How much does that kind of affect women's perceptions of safety?
So I have talked to a lot of women as part of these studies about what would make them feel safer. And the surveillance cameras have come up. What I have found overwhelmingly is that women do not feel particularly safe by knowing that there are surveillance cameras, because as a number of them have mentioned, well, maybe these are going to help. If something happens later on, they may be able to find the person but who is going to help me in real time? Who is going to help me if I'm victimized, if I'm harassed in real time? And so, but on the other hand, what makes women less afraid is the fact of more of the natural surveillance, or the human factor. That if there are people around, if there is kind of a bus driver on the bus, if there is someone who is a conductor, if there is someone that they can go for help, or if it is a well-used place. I mean, again, coming back from my own experience, growing up in Athens, I had usually not a problem to walk in the streets quite late at night, because most areas were, at the center at least, were surrounded by a lot of people, men and women walking. And so you feel that there is a sense of protection, that nothing really bad can happen to you, especially walking was much more safer than getting on the bus, where you had this very congested space that people can attach their bodies to yours. But in the US, because walking is still very, very few people still walk, especially in residential areas, I would not walk by myself at night. And there is this fear that maybe justified or not, but it is this perception of danger because the settings are desolate, nobody's around. And this was coming up over and over again with women saying that we feel much more safe when it is a well-utilized place where there are people that we can go to. And there is also the perception, we're talking about criminologists would tell you that most criminals are quite rational. They don't want to be seen, they don't want to be caught. And so it is much more difficult if there is this natural surveillance that something really horrible is going to happen to someone. Taking away terrorist acts and things like that. So, and so looking into what the transportation agencies were doing to protect their transit riders, I was finding a certain level of mismatch where a lot of transportation agencies would equip a number of settings with these CCTV cameras, etc., but these were not the types of devices that were particularly helpful to women.
So, I think that kind of this point about more eyes on the street and then things like that it would be more helpful if more people were on transit, kind of out, and then kind of that when we're looking at this a lot about that the bus doesn't come very often. So I think it's a gross simplification, but in terms of combating women's kind of fears and particularly with the bus stop and for what transit riders want, it's like a lot about frequency. It's like just kind of run the buses more. People like it because they have buses that come more often, and then you don't have this. So a lot of it's interesting that a lot of it just comes back to how often the bus comes. So
or at least even to know when the bus comes, so that if the bus is going to come in 20 minutes. If I know that the bus is going to come in 20 minutes, I don't need to wait for 19 minutes on the bus stop. Now, I fully understand that we're talking about congestion and traffic here, and this is much more difficult to do in places like Los Angeles, because the bus driver may have every intention to bring the bus at a specific time, but because of congestion, the bus is very late. And sometimes, often, number of these women were saying that the bus comes and they don't even stop because it is overcrowded. And so they have no room for anybody else. So your wait time and your stress doubles because you have to wait for the next bus.
So one example that I think is interesting that I saw when I was in Mexico City, and it's happened in other like very large cities, is women-only cars. So have you looked into those, and are they, how effective are they in terms of reducing this issue?
Yeah, actually you find women-only cars and women-only buses in Mexico City has started them, in India, in Japan, Brazil, and there is a lot of debate about them. Where they are operating, typically women are very happy about them because they feel that it gives them the option. It's not necessary to get on these wagons if they don't want to, but they can, and a number of them do. Talking to women in the US, the majority did not want these types of, because they felt that they may contribute to more discrimination. They felt that why do we need to have, why do we need to, a number of them felt that it was kind of an extreme measure. On the other hand, I mean, the other thing that has come up, and I was asked a number of times recently is, and I think there are some companies that are popping up now that the sharing economy is has taken off so much with Lyft and Uber, and there are some companies that the riders can request a woman driver. And when I was asked if I'm in favor of that, I said sure, because again, it gives the women, anything that gives women or men more options as a consumer, I think it's good. You don't need to use it if you don't want to, but why not having the opportunity to do it?
Well, that's, I have a couple more. I want to open it up to our audience about other questions that you may have. Questions?
Hi, Connie England with UCLA Transit Operations. Looking to the future, we're watching with interest the current engineering and designs for autonomous vehicle systems. Mm-hmm. And the current state of art is putting people in a small glass box, and if you have a problem, push a button, and help will be on its way. Do you have any comments or sort of critiques of that future that's being perpetuated by largely male engineers?
Yeah. You're pointing to a question that actually I think we need quite more research. I mean, we're at a kind of an interesting point where a lot of the driverless cars are happening. There are also discussions about drones. You know, you don't need pizza delivery or go and walk to the pizza place or drive. A drone is going to bring pizza into your house. And we have this new technology that is popping up, and I feel that things are changing, but we have not really studied very much the consequences. I think that if we do it right, some of this technology can be quite liberating for women, but if we do it wrong, it might be perpetuating the problem. I have not studied this, and so, I don't feel very comfortable kind of sharing anything with you because I definitely feel it is an area that we need more research. I would love to do more research in this area. And I think you pointed to one example. If it is only men engineers that are thinking of these things, chances are that there may have nothing to do. My immediate family has 3 men engineers, right? So have nothing against men engineers. but I think that we really need women's voices as we are designing these venues.
I mean, I think the point is that the bus driver does a lot more than drive the bus, right?
Yes.
Like the point about, if you're reporting harassment or anything like that. So that sometimes is something that seems to be a little left out of this conversation, particularly for autonomy in transit, is that there's a lot of other jobs that the bus driver is doing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, thank you. Jennifer Lowe with LA Metro. I'm here representing not only the agency, but the System Security and Law Enforcement Department. So thank you for including us in this discussion. Just to describe, and I have a follow-up question related to this, just to describe some of the work that we're doing that fits in line with some of your commentary. is to enhance the number of law enforcement personnel that we have out there, not only actual sworn officers, but observe and report. Because if you have presence, of course, that deters crime. We've launched a sexual harassment hotline. I don't know if everyone's familiar with our campaign, it's off limits. To not only curtail incidences before they occur, but also to meet the demand when they do occur to keep our clientele on the system. We have hotline support personnel out there, which is really innovative in the transportation industry. But on the prevention side, we utilize a function or an application, which is really just a communication tool called Transit Watch. And my question to you is, what type of effectiveness, if you've studied at all, is a Transit Watch type of component, which really is utilizing our customers to act as a neighborhood watch concept and observe and report incidences, and then communicate that to law enforcement personnel. Have you studied that? Is it considered effective?
So,
what are the implications
yeah.
and whatnot?
Well, first of all, thank you for telling us about what Metro is doing, and I actually think it might be a good time, and if anybody's interested in doing a capstone project on that, to kind of renew the survey of what transit agencies are doing, which was done, I did them in mid-2000s, and I was finding very little, and my hope is that, you know, much more is happening now, and your comments are indicating that. I have looked a little bit as it relates to transit terrorism and campaigns that places like Spain and especially the UK have done in terms of asking their passengers of going to the airport to report things that were suspicious. And these were tremendously effective. Actually, they were too effective because people were reporting almost everything and anything. And they had thankfully, many more reports than actual incidents, but it really brought quite a lot of awareness among the public. And so this is very much in the education aspect. We're educating the people to report into what they see and make the transit operator know about something. So when I looked into a bit about terrorist incidents and attacks and different lessons from overseas, it seemed to be quite effective. I have not particularly looked transit in the US and how effective it is, but my guess would be that it should be effective.
Thank you.
I think one thing that in the past few months that Me Too has shown is that there isn't a stereotypical kind of predator or harasser, and that the harassment that many women or people with oppressed identities experience is from someone that is not obviously a criminal and doesn't consider themselves a criminal. And I feel like the examples that you were talking about that transit agencies are using seem really more focused on women and their response and making sure, well, you go sit in the women-only car or sit in the front and create this space for yourself that is safer without necessarily addressing what the actual problem is, which is men who feel like this behavior is normal and they're entitled to it. So I guess my question is, what onus do transit agencies have to do education that's not just about response for the woman who is harassed or for people around to respond to harassment, but is directed towards the potential harasser themselves?
Yeah, you're bringing up a larger issue, which is more of a structural issue, and I think it is the responsibility of not only the transit agency, but society, and it is something that should start with schools and about issues of respect and issues of, if you look into sexual harassment on campus, that also, campaigns have taken off in the last decade and all that about understanding what no means and all that. So it is definitely a much larger issue that, kind of educate our sons and young men, etc. But I was primarily focusing on what transit agency, so this is a much larger and, strategy that takes time, and we should start right away if we haven't started yet. But I was talking more about what kind of interventions transit agencies could do right now to help women. It doesn't mean that these interventions should not happen within the larger strategy that you're describing.
You mentioned that a number of the women in your survey felt uncomfortable contacting law enforcement, and
I mean, just
The Latinas primarily.
Yeah. And I know from my people I know, there's disproportionate targeting of law enforcement toward particularly Black people, people of color on transit, and I'm assuming that would happen with harassment being reported as well. So I guess I'm wondering, how do you manage this type of issue without involving law enforcement?
I'm not sure I understood the question.
I guess, how do you how do you create this atmosphere of safety without involving the police?
Yeah. First of all, let me say that there were three primary reasons why this is the most underreported type of crime. Number one is women feel ashamed. Number two, the women that talked to me felt that there was nothing much for the police to do, because by the time they report, the person is gone, which is also true. And third, in particular with Latina women, they were afraid of the police. So there were all these issues. And actually, if you look into more serious, what FBI calls type A crime, which is rape is the most underreported of all type A crimes. And sexual harassment is type B crimes. Crimes of sexual nature are the most underreported crimes everywhere. So it is very difficult to have a police officer on every bus. I mean, it's impossible. It's extremely expensive. And so trying to find what, on the one hand, staff can do, like the bus rider, on the other hand, what we can contribute as fellow citizens. And lastly, what we can do also through environmental design. How do we create settings that are safer, that really sometimes has to do with lighting. I mean, lighting at the bus stop is very important, because someone attacks you, much easier to be seen if it is well lit. I mean, there are a number of environmental design strategies that will make settings safer. I mean, nothing is foolproof 100%, but there are all these different strategies that you can make a safer space that does not involve only policing.
I mean, the difficulty thing, as she brought up, is that we know that there's kind of a disproportionate arrests of people of color, and that also people of color disproportionately ride transit. So really, I think keeping that in mind as trying to target this issue, to say you mentioned this idea about universality, is there's not just something that's crime prevention in general may not actually be appropriate, really kind of looking at who's riding transit and what are particular strategies for that group, keeping in mind other kind of norms and contexts that are kind of going on underneath. Brad?
Oh, thanks. So I was just going back to what the representative from Metro was talking about reporting sexual assault on buses. When I was a senior in high school, riding back from a summer course I was taking here at UCLA on the big blue bus, I saw a man go up to a woman, put his arm around her, sit down, and start to fondle her. And it seemed pretty obviously sexual harassment in nature, but I was afraid to report the instance just because this was a burly man who seemed like he would be unpredictable, and I was just a high school student, and my timidity in reporting that crime really shook me for a couple of weeks. It was really experience that left a big impact on me mentally, and I'm just wondering if there's new apps that are being developed, or these new services allow people to really report in an anonymous fashion, and if they allow for sort of timely context-sensitive responses, because oftentimes the driver was there in front and he was not paying attention to what was going on, and there were other passengers around who weren't paying attention. So it's obviously
and nobody said anything.
No, I mean, no. I think I was the only one who like even looked for, at least from, I was trying
Yeah,
not to
yeah.
stare too intently just because I didn't want to elicit a reaction, but when I looked around, I didn't seem to be anyone else staring or paying attention.
I mean, that's the other thing, that most likely people knew what was happening, but they were avoiding to get involved, and so they were looking elsewhere, which is a typical response, unfortunately, of which, that's where, you know, the social responsibility comes up, where, you know, if you are in a place that you see a fellow rider being victimized, what do you do about it? And unfortunately, up to now, at least, most people would do nothing. I don't know if you have seen that famous Seinfeld episode where everybody's doing something horrible and nobody's, it's the opposite of the Good Samaritan. Everybody's looking away. And so, again, and that's something that, I mean, since we have you here, you're the token person from Metro, maybe you want to respond. Is there anything that, I mean, are now the bus drivers trained to respond to
Yes.
things like
So,
that?
So on the operator side, they have an ability to report if they were observing, unlike this case. They can call for help. They don't have to identify what's occurring. They can essentially identify code red, so to speak. And then they would have immediate police response. And there's a number of different actors in this case. The observer, the student here, and by the way, I want to identify Big Blue Bus is also Santa Monica. That's not to say that we don't have incidences occurring as well that we address. But our technology app, we call that Transit Watch, does have an anonymous reporting ability, which, and given that's on a smartphone, and not everybody has a smartphone, and not all the time that, in not every situation do you have actual Wi-Fi connection, although we're improving that. There is an ability to submit a complaint by your smartphone through a Transit Watch app, and part of our due diligence that we have to ensure is that we educate our passengers that the Transit Watch is present and available, that they can report incidences like what was witnessed. We have a very robust informational campaign related to sexual harassment called It's Off Limits. We educate our passengers that sexual harassment is not to be tolerated on transportation, be it an observer or a victim or an assailant. And not only do we say it's off limits, but again, we have the hotline to support victims that is not tied to law enforcement, where they can speak to hotline personnel and get emotional support. And what we do with that information on the back end is we use it to not necessarily tie that patron to law enforcement personnel, but rather utilize it in our deployment. So we know where the incident occurred, and then on the back end, we try to deploy officers if there's trends to be able to prevent incidences like what you witnessed.
But let's say if Raylan sees that and he goes into his cell phone, gets the app and sends you a message. Is there anything you can do in real time? No.
So that is actually a real-time function. So we have personnel at our deployment center who are monitoring not only the intake, but also the service calls, the actual phone calls that you can also call Transit Watch. So, right, there's a
Can you
digital-
communicate with a driver at that time?
No. It actually, that is communicated directly with law enforcement. So you don't even have to engage with the driver. Sometimes drivers don't have a listening ear, sometimes they do. Sometimes you end up in a precarious position if you even approach a driver. You don't want to do that. It's clear based on the incident that you've had happen. But all information that's reported, no matter the methodology, goes directly to law enforcement for deployment.
Okay, another question?
Yeah, this is a question for you both of you.
I apologize.
What was the response time, if you found any, of sort of like, for like incidents of harassment, and if Metro has a response time for harassment?
Really good.
Thank you.
That's for you, not for me. Because I don't know
Sure.
that.
So, our response time for incidences, and let me remind you, sexual harassment is of course different from criminal incidences such as rape. I mean, harassment in the mind of the victim, feeling like their rights have been infringed on, and then there's also the element of criminal cases too, issues that amount to a crime, right? Rape, physical assault, things like that. There's a whole litany of issues that fall
But
into that.
harassment is also a crime. It's just type A and type B. So harassment is a crime. It is not characterized as type A crime, which is rape and aggravated
I'm
assault.
talking about prosecutable
Yeah.
crimes. And so for our high-level incidences, so if an emergency response, such as the fondling that you're witnessing that may have not been consensual, that would be essentially like a code red, and that would have a 6-minute response. And that's essentially a bus out in the middle of Los Angeles having a 6-minute response, which is pretty good. May not be immediate, but 6-minute is, from my understanding, at industry standard, if not above.
Other questions? Mark?
Couple of comments. In most cities, bus stops are more commonly the locale of the incident than on the bus.
True.
And in most cities, the bus stops are under the jurisdiction of the municipal police and not the transit police. So you have a jurisdictional issue. And it's actually very important. It can affect response time dramatically. And in some cities, like Inglewood, they actually have units that they deploy to the bus stop, and they follow, the police in plainclothes follow vulnerable-looking people from the bus stop to their home at a distance, observing, because of their awareness of this type of crime. So there are programs all around us, but they are very diffuse. They're not all under Metro's jurisdiction. The second comment I'd make is that bus drivers were mentioned many times. Bus drivers are unionized, and the unions have rules about seniority. That means that the young, increasingly female, increasingly minority drivers get the worst assignments. They drive at 3 in the morning, and their routes end at isolated locations, and they are very vulnerable to sex-related crime. They are more commonly the victim because they're on duty all the time than are passengers, and that should be noted, and it's also being taken care of. The union has become more aware of it, but it's a pervasive problem across the whole country.
Yeah, and that's an important point. I think that's another kind of talks about the universality of needs, where in that situation women are much more vulnerable if they're sent into the most high crime neighborhoods 3 a.m. in the morning to be the bus driver of a car, and it's an issue.
Did either of these topics come up in the interviews with agencies, whether it be like, oh, well, the stop isn't in our jurisdiction, or did they talk about the safety of their drivers as well as their passengers?
Well, the agencies had, a lot of the agencies, what Marty mentioned, his first comment, which is very true, the jurisdiction where the bus stops are located are not the agency jurisdiction. And so you see that the agencies, their attitude is that there is nothing much we can do about that, which is again a mismatch of the transit riders' needs, the women's transit riders, and I'm not saying that it's the transit operator that is to blame, but the women feel more vulnerable waiting the bus that they're on the bus stop, and yet it is another authority. So here we need to have much more coordination. Again, going back to the UK and Transport for London, the city and Transport for London very much coordinated and created a number of what they call safe bus stops, and kind of retrofitted a lot of these settings so that they're much safer, that they have buttons that you can report and all that. And so there was a real coordination because the attitude that quite often we find here, we have such a fragmentation of authority, but the trip is a complete trip. It is not only on the bus or on the train. It starts from your door and it ends to the door of your destination. So it involves the trip to the bus stop, waiting at the bus stop, being on the bus, and then again the trip. So when the transit operator is only responsible for the bus, and then there are other authorities responsible for the other thing, and there is no coordination, that again is problematic.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully, this fragmentation is particularly being for Metro, as there's the operators are going, one line to go through 4 different jurisdictions or something. But it is nice to see, I think, at the county level, I know that the supervisors are really kind of putting a focus on women's issues and trying to see if there's some kind of higher level to try to do some of the coordination effort to try to kind of get past this fragmentation issue. Other questions? Bridget?
I was going to ask you about the opportunities for making sweeping change. Is opportunities really for public transportation specifically through the FTA, or how do we follow suit with some of the European countries that have not only with the safety issue, but just I happen to be a mother of twins, and when my children were babies, the only way I could get on the bus where I lived was by taking them out of a double stroller. Carrying 2 babies in one arm and a stroller in the other is impossible. And that's not uncommon, and it doesn't seem to be, I even worked at the transit agency at the time, and there was an outside group lobbying to have this change, and it was just sort of stuck in they didn't know how to still comply with ADA and allow the strollers to have space, and who would have precedence, a stroller or a wheelchair, and it was just so complicated. It seems like we need some level of federal or state
Yes,
guidance.
I would absolutely agree. I think that we lead, that's why I mentioned the federal involvement in some of these countries and the gender mainstreaming policy, but it is not only this, it should come with resources, because a lot of the local transit operators, some smaller than others, would say, and justifiably, that we would love to do this if only we had the resources. And so if there are federal resources that are specifically geared to gender mainstream a number of these settings, it would be tremendously helpful. And again, it is not an exotic idea, because we see other countries doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this idea that Bridget brought up is that, so it's, correct me if I'm wrong, is that you actually have to collapse the stroller on the bus, right?
Before you get on.
Before you get on.
You have to collapse the stroller. It has to be collapsed while you're on board. And then there was this debate, and this was in San Francisco, about whether we could allow strollers to be where the wheelchairs would normally be. But then if someone with a wheelchair needs that space, how would they get them to move it? And I think it just was perplexing from a policy standpoint, given the infrastructure. They weren't going to run out and buy a bunch of new buses, and even if they could.
And they have to be low floor.
Yeah, and would they be willing to dedicate a space that was more ambiguous, like you see in trains in Europe and things like that? And so I just wonder how, this is a good moment in time to push for some of those changes at a federal level, but who is going to do that, and how is that going to happen, is really my question.
Yeah, and then how do you do that in a way that doesn't take, privilege and kind of, take space or kind of the opportunity away from people that have real needs with ADA. You don't want to encroach on that, but that it can't really be a zero sum, right? So how do you kind of give more accessibility and more options and flexibility for everyone to be on the buses and trains?
Absolutely, and I'm a big believer in design. Of course, I'm biased. I come from a design background, but I still feel that there are a number of some of these things that can be resolved through a better design of the buses, as long as it is something that it is a goal that we really need to redesign the vehicle in ways that it absolutely is comfortable for people with disabilities, but is also comfortable to someone that has a stroller. And it has happened. I mean, there are one of these things, we don't absolutely need to reinvent the wheel. I mean, if we really look into some of the best examples in other countries, you do find that.
So I think we're out of time. I think there's a lot of great thoughts about how design inside and outside the vehicle, as long as kind of safety and security. So we actually, a paper that Professor Loukaitou-Sideris put out last year, we actually just put up a policy brief about kind of women gender transport. So we'll go ahead and email that to all of you today. We also, we're putting this on our YouTube channel. So if you have anyone else that you'd like to share this conversation with, you can go to our ITS channel on YouTube, and it'll be up right afterwards. And with that, I want to thank you all for joining, and thank you, Professor.
This is